August 15th, 1945, Camp Sheridan, Nebraska. The air, thick with the scent of hot dust and dry grass, crackled with a tension Kenji had not felt since the battlefield. It wasn't the fear of shells, but the terrifying silence between them. Inside the mess hall, the radio announcer's voice, once a smooth river of propaganda and swing music, had turned brittle. He spoke of an emperor, a surrender, an end. The words were incomprehensible. Men around him were weeping. Others stared into their tin cups, faces pale and still. A sudden shout erupted from the camp guard station, a roar of victory that sounded like violence. Instinctively, Kenji moved to shield a younger prisoner, Ito, who was trembling uncontrollably. Sarah, the American nurse, stepped quickly between their line and the doorway, her presence a small but solid shield. Her gaze was not triumphant, but filled with a strange, aching pity. On the wall behind her, a neatly painted sign read, "Orderly conduct is a sign of character." It had always seemed a gentle rule. Now it felt like the only thing holding the world together. "It's all right, Kenji," she said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the noise. "Just stay calm. Everyone just stay calm. Follow our journey to see how such a moment of quiet humanity became possible, and feel free to share which country you are watching from in the comments." 14 months earlier, a transport train, somewhere in California. The world for weeks had been nothing but the rhythmic clatter of steel on steel and the suffocating darkness of the transport car. When the doors finally slid open, the light was a physical blow, a white, blinding sheet that bleached the sky and flattened the landscape into an endless expanse of pale earth and dry grass. Kenji Tanaka shielded his eyes, his first breath of Nebraska air shockingly clean, carrying the alien scents of soap and baking bread. He and the others were marched in a column toward a series of long, black-roofed wooden buildings surrounded by fences that seemed almost insultingly low. There were no watchtowers looming with menace, no snarling dogs. The American guards were tall and moved with a lazy efficiency that was more unnerving than outright cruelty. They carried rifles, but held them pointed toward the ground. Inside the first building, the processing began. They were stripped, showered with hot water, a forgotten luxury, and deloused with a pungent white powder. Kenji expected shouting, shoving, the casual violence of conquerors. Instead, he was met with a bureaucratic calm. A medic with weary eyes checked his teeth. A clerk with ink-stained fingers recorded his name and number. The entire procedure was impersonal, orderly, and deeply confusing. This was not the behavior of the decadent, undisciplined demons from the propaganda posters. They were issued clothes, blue denim work pants, a chambray shirt, and boots that felt impossibly sturdy. Then came the final items, laid out on a plain wooden table: a towel, a small metal tin of shaving soap, and a bar of lye soap. Beside them lay an object that made Kenji stop. It was a toothbrush. Not a worn-out stick with a few bristles, but a new one, its plastic handle a clean, sterile white, sealed in cellophane. He picked it up. The weight was negligible, but it felt as heavy as a stone in his palm. He thought of the communal bamboo twigs they had used back in the barracks in Manila, worn smooth and shared among a dozen men. This small, mass-produced item felt like a piece of a different reality, a testament to a surplus he could not comprehend. A guard nudged him forward. "Keep moving." Kenji clutched the toothbrush in his hand as he was led to his assigned bunk. The gesture was not kind, nor was it cruel. It was simply a transaction, and that was the most disorienting thing of all. He sat on the cot, the coarse wool blanket rough against his skin, and stared at the object in his hand. It was a tool for hygiene, nothing more, yet it was also the first crack in the foundation of his world. Life inside Camp Sheridan settled into a rhythm as stark and unyielding as the landscape. The days were measured not by hours, but by bells and bugle calls. A bell for wake-up in the pre-dawn chill, a bell for roll call on the gravel yard, a bell for meals in the cavernous mess hall where the clatter of hundreds of tin trays echoed like a factory. For Kenji, an engineering student who had once thrived on precision, the rigid predictability was a strange sort of comfort. It was a machine, and if you learned its gears, you could avoid being crushed by them. His strategy was simple: invisibility. He kept his head down, his movements economical, his expression neutral. He performed his assigned duties, peeling potatoes, scrubbing floors, mending clothes, with a quiet diligence that drew no notice. He observed the unwritten rules of the barracks, where the senior NCOs slept, who were the gamblers, who were the devout. He kept to himself, his only private ritual, the act of using the toothbrush. Each morning, the synthetic bristles a small, sharp reminder of the unreality of his situation. The guards were a constant presence, but it was Sergeant Miller who became the face of their captivity. He was a man in his late 30s, with a sun-creased face and eyes that saw everything but revealed nothing. He wasn't cruel. He rarely raised his voice, but his quiet authority was absolute. He walked the perimeter, supervised the work details within the camp, and presided over roll call with a clipboard and an unwavering gaze. Kenji learned to read the slight tightening of Miller's jaw, the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. These were the signs of a storm brewing, a sign to make oneself even smaller. One morning, after the black coffee and rye bread, Miller did not dismiss them. He held up his clipboard. The following men, he announced, his voice carrying easily in the still air, have been assigned to an external work detail, sugar beet harvesting, per the agreement with local farmers to alleviate labor shortages. He began to read the names. Each one was a stone dropped into the quiet pond of the morning. Men straightened, their faces a mixture of apprehension and something else, a flicker of interest. The camp, for all its strange comforts, was a cage. The outside was a terrifying unknown, but it was also a change. Tanaka, Kenji. The name hung in the air. Kenji's blood went cold. He had worked so hard to become a shadow, a number, to blend into the machinery of the camp. Now, he had been singled out. He felt the eyes of the other prisoners on him. He took a slow breath, the air tasting of dust, and stepped forward as instructed. The relative safety of the camp walls was about to disappear behind him. Ahead lay the fields, the civilians, the real America. The army truck rumbled over a dirt road, kicking up a plume of fine, golden dust. The world outside the wire was vast and empty, a seemingly infinite stretch of sky arching over flat, tilled earth. Kenji sat ramrod straight on the wooden bench, the vibrations of the engine traveling up his spine. He and the 10 other prisoners were silent, the weight of the open space pressing in on them. They passed a farmhouse with a sagging porch, then another until the truck slowed and turned onto a lane flanked by cottonwood trees. It stopped beside a modest, unpainted barn. A man emerged from the house. He was lean and weathered, his face a map of lines carved by sun and wind. This was Alistair Finch. He nodded once at Sergeant Miller, a greeting devoid of warmth but also of malice. His eyes swept over the prisoners, lingering on no one, his expression unreadable. He gestured toward a sprawling field of leafy green plants, sugar beets. The work was brutal, monotonous, and honest. Under the relentless sun, they learned the rhythm of the hoe, chopping weeds from around the base of the plants. Finch worked in a parallel row, moving with a steady, practiced economy that none of them could match. He did not speak to them. Sergeant Miller watched from the shade of the truck, his rifle resting across his lap. The only sounds were the scrape of metal on earth, the rustle of leaves, and the cawing of distant crows. It was a silence filled with unspoken rules. At midday, a bell rang from the farmhouse. Finch straightened his back, wiping a forearm across his brow, and walked toward the house. A woman, his wife, came out carrying a basket. She met him by a large oak tree and began to set out his lunch. Kenji, resting on his hoe, watched from a distance. He expected to see the man eat from a tin pail as a soldier would. Instead, the woman unfolded a piece of fabric and spread it over a wooden crate. It was a white tablecloth, brilliantly, impossibly white against the brown dust of the farm. She placed a plate, a glass of milk, and a sandwich upon it. The simple, deliberate act was jarring. It was a ritual, a small pocket of domestic order carved out of the rugged landscape. Kenji felt a sudden, sharp pang of homesickness, so intense it almost buckled his knees. He thought of his mother setting the dinner table in their small Tokyo apartment, a world away, a lifetime ago. These people, his enemies, had a life that simply continued. His gaze drifted past them, toward the barn. Parked beside it, covered in a fine layer of dust, was an old black Ford truck. He assumed naturally that it belonged to the army. For the rest of the afternoon, the black truck sat by the barn, a silent, hulking shape in Kenji's peripheral vision. He tried to dismiss it, to focus on the rhythmic ache in his shoulders and the bite of the hoe against the dry soil. It was an army vehicle, he told himself, left here for the farmer's use, a tool of the state, nothing more. In Japan, steel was a sacred resource, every ounce fed to the war machine to forge ships, planes, and guns. The idea of it being used for a mere personal conveyance was not just wasteful, it was unthinkable. As the sun dipped lower, casting long, distorted shadows across the fields, Sergeant Miller called an end to the day's work. The prisoners gathered their tools, their movements slow with fatigue. Kenji watched as Alistair Finch walked to a water pump, washed his hands and face, and dried them on a rough cloth. Then he walked directly to the Sford truck. Kenji froze, his hand resting on a wooden fence post. This was it. The soldier would drive the farmer home, or perhaps the farmer was a low-ranking reservist tasked with overseeing them. He watched, waiting for the familiar sight of a uniformed man getting behind the wheel. But no one else appeared. Finch opened the driver's side door, swung himself onto the worn leather seat, and inserted a small metallic object into the dashboard. A key. He gave it a turn. The engine sputtered once, coughed a puff of blue-gray smoke, and then roared to life with a deep, mechanical rumble. The sound was not like a military engine, loud, aggressive, and overwhelming. This was a contained, purposeful power. It was the sound of a tool, not a weapon. Finch put the truck into gear, and with a slight lurch, drove it slowly into the cavernous darkness of the barn. He owned this. This machine of steel, rubber, and controlled explosions belonged to a man who worked the soil. The sight did not compute. It was a detail so profoundly wrong, so contrary to the fundamental laws of the world as Kenji understood them, that his mind struggled to process it. Propaganda had painted a picture of a soft, decadent America, a nation of selfish individuals whose system was collapsing. But this casual ownership of industrial might by a common man, was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign of a power so vast, so deeply embedded in the fabric of the society, that it could be taken for granted. The sound of that engine was louder than any bomb he had ever heard. On the ride back to camp, Kenji said nothing, the image of the farmer's calloused hand turning the key burning behind his eyes. The barracks were thick with the familiar evening smells of sweat, damp wool, and tobacco smoke. Men sat on their cots, cleaning their mess kits, playing quiet games of Go, or simply staring at the wooden rafters, lost in their own worlds. The silence here was different from the silence of the fields. It was a heavy, shared silence, woven from memory and loss. Tonight for Kenji, it felt suffocating. He found Ito, the young private he had instinctively shielded during the confusing news of a distant battle weeks ago, carefully polishing his boots. "Ito-san," Kenji began, his voice low, "today at the farm, I saw something strange." Ito looked up, his eyes wary. "Strange how?" "The farmer. He has his own motor truck, a Ford. I saw him start it himself." The young man blinked, his brow furrowed in confusion. "An army truck, you mean?" "No," Kenji insisted, keeping his voice even. "It was his. Private. For the farm." The statement, so simple and factual, hung in the humid air. It drew the attention of the man on the neighboring bunk, Corporal Mori. Mori was an older man, a career soldier with a hard, unyielding face and a gaze that seemed to miss nothing. He had been a symbol of order and discipline since their capture. "What nonsense is this, Tanaka?" Mori's voice was sharp, cutting through the low murmur of the room. "You saw what they wanted you to see." "It was no performance," Kenji countered, his voice firmer than he expected. "It was old, dusty. It was a tool, like his hoe." Mori stood up, his presence commanding immediate attention. "It is a trick," he declared, his voice resonating with authority. "A piece of theater. They place it there to make you believe in their wealth, to make you weak, to make you forget your duty." He scanned the faces of the men now watching them. "America is a hollow shell, rotting from the inside. Do not be fooled by their cheap illusions." His words, steeped in the familiar rhetoric of the war, were a balm to the other men. They nodded in agreement, their expressions clearing. It was an explanation that made sense, that restored the world to its proper order. The farmer's truck was a lie, and they were the wise soldiers who had seen through it. Mori fixed his gaze on Kenji. "We will not speak of this again. It is poison." The conversation was over. Kenji gave a slight, formal bow and returned to his cot, the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes on his back. He lay down, his body aching from the day's labor, but his mind raced. Was Mori right? Was it all a carefully constructed lie? He slipped a hand into his pocket, his fingers closing around the smooth, hard plastic of the toothbrush. It felt solid. It felt real. And he was utterly, terrifyingly alone. A week later, Kenji's hand slipped while he was cleaning a hoe. The sharp edge of the metal head sliced a clean, deep gash across his palm. It was not a serious wound, but it bled freely, and the rust-colored farm soil clung to the raw flesh. Sergeant Miller, his face impassive, gestured with his head toward the infirmary upon their return to camp. "Get that seen to, Tanaka." The infirmary was a small, quiet building that smelled sharply of rubbing alcohol and laundry soap. A woman in a crisp, white nurse's uniform looked up from a desk as he entered. She was young, with calm, steady eyes, and hair the color of dried corn silk pinned neatly under her cap. This was Sarah. Kenji presented his hand wordlessly. He expected a rough, perfunctory cleaning, perhaps a harsh word about his carelessness. Instead, she guided him to a stool and gestured for him to sit. Her movements were efficient and gentle. She washed his hand with warm water, her touch surprisingly light, before examining the cut under the bright light of a gooseneck lamp. "This will need a few stitches," she said, her voice matter-of-fact. He simply nodded, his eyes fixed on the tray of instruments she was preparing. They lay gleaming and sterile on a small, neatly folded white tablecloth, the same stark, purposeful white as the one on Finch's farm. It was a symbol of a world that was ordered and clean, a world he was beginning to see everywhere. She worked in silence, her focus absolute. The needle was a tiny, sharp sting again and again, but her skill was undeniable. As she tied off the final suture, she did not dismiss him immediately. "What did you do?" she asked, her gaze meeting his for the first time. "Before the war?" The question was so simple, so direct, it completely disarmed him. No one had asked that. He was prisoner Section 1134. He was a Japanese soldier. He was a farm laborer. He had not been Kenji Tanaka for a very long time. The inquiry was not an interrogation. It was an act of simple human curiosity. It acknowledged a past, and therefore, a person. He hesitated for a long moment, the scent of antiseptic filling his senses. "I was a student," he finally said, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. "Engineering, at the university in Tokyo." Sarah nodded slowly, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. "Engineering," she repeated softly, as if placing a final, clean bandage over the wound. The brief connection, the acknowledgement of a life beyond the uniform and the wire, was more profound than any physical treatment. As Kenji walked back to his barracks, the throbbing in his hand was a dull ache, but his mind was clear. The farmer's Ford was not a trick. The white tablecloth was not a performance. They were pieces of a pattern, and he was just beginning to see its shape. A fragile sense of normalcy had begun to settle over Kenji. The work on the Finch farm was hard, but the physical exhaustion brought a dreamless sleep. His hand healed into a neat white scar. He and Sarah exchanged quiet, respectful nods when she visited the mess hall. He was beginning to learn the cadence of this strange new life, to anticipate its rhythms. He had even started to believe that Corporal Mori's rigid distrust was a relic of a world that no longer existed. The illusion was shattered in the camp latrine. Tucked beside a stack of old catalogs used for paper was a section of a local newspaper, discarded and creased. Curiosity, a feeling he had suppressed for months, stirred in him. He took the paper back to his bunk, waiting until the dim lights of the barracks signaled the end of the day. Spreading the fragile newsprint on his blanket, he began the slow, laborious work of translation. He had learned some English from engineering textbooks in Tokyo, but this was a different language entirely, idiomatic, emotional, and violent. His dictionary, a treasured item he had managed to keep, was of little help with the tone, but the words themselves were clear enough. The article was an editorial, a column of dense black ink under the headline, "A Slap in the Face to Our Boys in Uniform." The writer, a local citizen, raged against the treatment of the prisoners. He spoke of American soldiers dying in the Pacific while their enemy was being coddled on American soil. He described the work release program not as an economic necessity, but as a moral failing, a disgrace to the memory of the fallen. Kenji's fingers traced the harsh, angular letters of phrases he painstakingly deciphered. Enemy mouths fed before our own, living in comfort. A mockery of our sacrifice. A cold dread spread through Kenji's chest, chilling him more than the Nebraska night air. The kindness he had received from Sarah, the quiet respect from Finch, he had mistaken these for the rule when they were clearly the exception. The camp was not a strange extension of American society. It was a bubble, meticulously maintained by government policy and the professionalism of men like Sergeant Miller. Outside this bubble, just beyond the wire, was a sea of resentment. It was a different kind of war, not of bullets and steel, but of words and hatred, and it was a war they were still losing. The next morning, Sergeant Miller's face was set in harder lines. His orders were clipped, his gaze sweeping over them with a renewed edge of suspicion. The editorial had been read. The outside world had pressed in, and the fragile peace of the camp felt thinner than ever. The atmosphere on the farm had been tense for days. Sergeant Miller was more rigid, a direct reflection of the pressure he was getting from his superiors. Finch was more withdrawn, the wary distance returning to his eyes. The prisoners worked in a sullen silence, the words of the newspaper editorial hanging between them like a shroud. It was in this charged environment that the water pump sputtered, choked, and died. Loud curse escaped Alistair Finch's lips, the first real emotion Kenji had seen him display. He kicked the base of the machine, his frustration palpable. The pump was the lifeblood of the farm, and without it, the fields would wither. Sergeant Miller strode over, his face a mask of annoyance. "Can you fix it?" he asked Finch. The farmer shook his head, wiping grease and sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "Need a new part. Might take a week to get it from town." Kenji watched from the edge of the group. He recognized the rhythmic squeak and the final grinding halt. It wasn't a broken part. The fuel line was likely clogged. It was a simple problem, one he had solved a dozen times on smaller engines in his university workshop. But to speak up now, in this climate of renewed hostility, was a tremendous risk. He was a prisoner, a laborer. Offering this kind of help was a transgression, a step outside his designated role. He could feel Maury's eyes on him, cold and warning. Yet, the sight of the broken machine was an offense to his very nature. It was an elegant system thrown into chaos by a simple flaw. He thought of the Kenam furred truck, sitting silently by the barn, another elegant system of moving parts. In that moment, the desire to restore order was stronger than his fear. He stepped forward. "Sergeant," he said, his voice quiet but clear. All eyes turned to him. "I can?" He pointed to his own chest. "Engineer." Then he pointed at the silent pump. "I can fix." A tense silence fell over the small group. Miller stared at him, his expression a mixture of disbelief and calculation. Finch looked from Kenji to the broken pump, desperation warring with deep-seated suspicion. Kenji held his ground, his gaze steady. It was Miller who finally broke the silence, giving a short, sharp nod. "Get him your tools, Finch." Alistair hesitated for another second before fetching a heavy metal toolbox. He handed Kenji a wrench. The tool felt cool, solid, and wonderfully familiar in his hand. For the first time in years, he was not holding a rifle or a hoe, but an instrument of creation. He knelt, his mind clearing, the angry words of men and the complexities of war fading away. There was only the machine and its problem. He worked quickly and with purpose, his hands sure and practiced. He cleared the fuel line, adjusted the carburetor, and cleaned the spark plug. 20 minutes later, he stood up and nodded to Finch. "Try now." Finch pulled the cord. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then roared to life, settling into a smooth, steady rhythm. Water gushed from the pipe. The farmer stared at the pump, then at Kenji. He said nothing, but for the first time, he looked Kenji directly in the eye, and in his gaze was a raw, undeniable gratitude. Across the yard, Corporal Maury turned his back, his shoulders rigid with fury. The divide between them was now a chasm. The summer of 1945 passed in a strange, suspended state. The work on the farm continued, but the tension had bled out of the air, replaced by a shared, unspoken waiting. The news of distant, terrible bombs and collapsing fronts reached them in fragmented whispers. Kenji's act of fixing the pump had earned him a new status. He was no longer just a laborer. He was the engineer. Finch would occasionally ask his opinion on a piece of equipment, a small gesture that was a universe of recognition. But a heavy stillness had settled over the camp, the silence of a held breath. On August 15th, the breath was released in a collective gasp. The midday meal was interrupted by an order from the camp commander. All prisoners were to remain in the mess hall. No one was to return to the barracks. A silence fell, thick with dread. Then, the large shortwave radio in the corner, usually reserved for swing music and American news, was turned on, its volume dialed unusually high. The air crackled with static. Then a voice emerged, an American announcer, his tone somber and historic. An English translator stood beside the radio, his face pale, ready to relay the message into a microphone connected to the hall's speakers. Kenji felt his heart begin to pound, a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. The announcer spoke of an address by the Japanese emperor. He spoke of the Potsdam Declaration. He used the word surrender. The translator's voice followed, flat and emotionless, turning the English words into a Japanese death sentence. Gyokuon Hoso. The jewel voice broadcast. The emperor himself, his divine voice rendered mortal by the crackle of radio waves, was telling them the war was over, that they had lost. The reaction was a wave of pure, unadulterated shock. One man let out a strangled cry. Another began to weep openly, his body shaking with racking sobs. Most, like Kenji, were simply frozen, their faces drained of all color, their minds refusing to accept what their ears had heard. The entire purpose of their existence, their sacrifice, their honor, the deaths of their comrades, had been erased by a voice from a box. A sudden, triumphant roar erupted from the guard station outside, the sound of their victory a brutal counterpoint to the prisoners' despair. The noise broke the spell. A young private, Ito, began to tremble violently. Instinct, born not of training but of shared experience, took over. Kenji moved, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder, turning his own body to partially shield him from the doorway. It was then that Sarah, the nurse, appeared, stepping quickly into the doorway. She wasn't celebrating. Her face was filled with a deep, aching compassion. On the wall behind her, the neatly painted sign read, "Orderly conduct is a sign of character." It seemed a rule from another century. Sarah's eyes found his. "It will be all right, Kenji," she said, her voice a near whisper that somehow cut through the rising chaos. "Everyone just needs to stay calm." He heard the words, and in that moment, he finally understood. The war was not lost because of a new bomb or a superior army. It had been lost long ago. It was lost in the quiet efficiency of a factory that could produce millions of toothbrushes. It was lost in the simple domestic ritual of a chout white tablecloth. It was lost in the engine of a farmer's private Ford truck. It was a war of systems, and they had been defeated not by soldiers, but by a world they could not even imagine. The autumn air that swept across the Nebraska plains was crisp and carried the scent of distant wood smoke. The wait had been long, months of listless quiet after the storm of the surrender. Now, the day had come. They were going home. Kenji packed his few meager possessions into a small cloth bag. On his cot lay the toothbrush, its white plastic handle worn smooth from 2 years of use. It had been his first lesson in this country's strange power. He looked at it for a long moment, then turned and left it there. The understanding it represented was inside him now. He no longer needed the proof. They were marched out onto the same gravel yard where they had stood for countless roll calls. The process was, like their arrival, a matter of impersonal efficiency. Names were called from a list, numbers were checked, and the men were directed to a line of olive-drab buses, their engines rumbling in the cool morning air. There were no speeches, no farewells. It was simply the turning of a final page in a ledger. As Kenji waited his turn to board, his gaze drifted beyond the camp's main gate, which now stood wide open. Down the road, parked on the shoulder, was a familiar shape. It was the dusty, black Suckford truck. Leaning against its fender were two figures, Alistair Finch and the nurse, Sarah. They were not there in any official capacity. They were simply watching. They were too far away for words, and none were needed. Finch's face was as unreadable as ever, carved from the same stoic material as the land he worked. But as Kenji's eyes met his, the farmer lifted his chin in a single, small nod. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, a silent recognition that passed between two men who had once been enemies but had come to understand each other through the universal language of broken machines and hard work. It was all the closure Kenji needed. He boarded the bus, and as it pulled away, he did not look back at the camp. He looked instead at the truck, a small monument of civilian strength, until it disappeared from view. The bus took them to a train, and as the steel wheels began their rhythmic clatter, carrying him east toward the sea, Kenji stared out the window. He saw farmhouses, fields lying fallow for the winter, and small towns with their quiet main streets. He was no longer seeing an enemy landscape. He was seeing a country, built and maintained by men like Finch. And for the first time in years, he began to think about what he, Kenji Tanaka, the engineer, would build when he finally got home.